Picture this. The year is 1815, the Battle of Waterloo. A French bullet smashes into your knee. You are lying in the mud, and a regimental surgeon leans over you. His apron is stiff, standing upright from the dried blood of hundreds of soldiers. He hasn't washed his hands. In fact, he believes that laudable pus actually helps healing. In his hand is a saw he used a minute ago to amputate a cavalryman's leg. There is no anesthesia, just a glass of cheap brandy and a leather belt to bite on. Most likely, in 3 days, you will die in a feverish delirium from gangrene. Now rewind the clock. The year 100 AD, the Roman frontier in Germany. A barbarian javelin pierces your thigh. But here, everything is different. The Roman doctor doesn't smell of rot, but of sharp vinegar. His hands are clean. He washes the wound with hot wine, gives you a tincture of opium, and picks up a bronze instrument. He won't saw, he will fix. He will suture the vessels, stitch the wound, and in a month you will stand in formation again. How did this happen? Why, between the 1st and the 19th centuries, did battlefield medicine not progress, but degrade to the level of a slaughterhouse? Why did a Roman legionary have a better chance of survival than one of Napoleon's soldiers? The Romans treated medicine like engineers. Their system rested on 3 pillars. First, the soldier is an expensive investment. Losing a professional to infection means burning the treasury's money. Second, the tools. Their scalpels and clamps were so perfect that the design hasn't changed in 2,000 years. And third, paranoid hygiene. They didn't know about microbes, but they doused everything in vinegar and loved to sterilize tools over an open flame. Fire was almost a sacred method of purification for them. For a Roman, filth was a sign of barbarism, something from the world of unwashed Germans in manure, not a civilized man. This snobbery actually worked for survival just as effectively as steel. Let's break down how this factory for repairing humans worked.
Look at a legionary not as a soldier, but as a line item in a financial report. The leather belt creaks on him, sweat and march dust cling to the iron rings of his chainmail, a gladius clinks at his belt. Every detail is money. Iron, leather, grain, wine, instructor time, salary. But the most expensive thing is hidden under the armor. Years of drill, discipline, the ability not to run when a wall of barbarian shields flies at the formation. To grow such a fighter, you first have to pull him out of a village, feed him, teach him formation, force him to lift a shield and thrust a sword thousands of times, run him in the heat with full gear, for years. Equipment is a one-time expense, but training is an investment. And the older the soldier, the more scars on his body, the more expensive he is. A veteran who understands by sound when the line is buckling is worth 10 green recruits. Now imagine a barbarian militia. The chief blows a horn, peasants gather from the villages. Some have pitchforks, some axes, some a grandfather's shield. Today he plows, tomorrow he is a warrior. If he dies, they take his brother. No one counts how much this man cost. He cost almost nothing, expendable. Rome did not have this luxury. If a legionary dies, you can't just pluck the first person you see from the field to replace him. The centurion understood this in his bones. When he walked over the fallen bodies after a battle, he saw not only blood, but numbers. Over there lies a guy he spent 2 years teaching to hold the line under a hail of arrows. And over there, an old wolf who has seen 3 campaigns and knows how to keep the legion from falling apart in a swamp. Losing them because someone didn't bandage a wound in time isn't just painful, it is simply bad business. Romans knew how to think cynically. For them, a legion was like a modern special forces unit or a team of top managers. You don't fire an old director because he cut his finger on paper.
You protect him because his experience brings profit. It's the same here. An experienced soldier is an asset that needs to be protected no less than a weapons warehouse. By the way, you can build another warehouse. You cannot clone a veteran like that. From this logic, one simple rule was born. Losing a veteran to a scratch is a crime against the state. And if Rome spent years turning a peasant into a war machine, it wasn't going to give him to death without a fight. But just understanding the soldier is expensive is not enough. If a man is cut down by an arrow on the battlefield while the formation screams and crumbles around him, someone has to crawl under that iron rain, bandage him, pull him out, and drag him to a doctor. And here, Rome does what many armies won't reach for another 1,500 years. It builds the logistics of rescue just as it built roads and aqueducts. From the moment iron enters you to the moment you hold that iron in your hand again, you are guided through a chain. The first link in this chain are people who were officially allowed not to swing a sword, but to pull out those who had already fallen. Medics, who didn't hide behind backs, but climbed into the meat grinder.
In the roar of battle, when the air trembles with screams and the clang of metal, it is easy to miss the men running not at the enemy, but toward their own fallen. They don't have huge shields, they don't hold the line. Instead, a round leather bag, a capsa, hangs over their shoulder. They were called capsarii. These were the first professional combat medics in history. Usually, in ancient armies, a wounded man was left to fend for himself. Did you fall? If you're lucky, friends will drag you out after the battle. If not, looters will finish you off, or your own cavalry will trample you. In the Roman legion, survival ceased to be a lottery. In every cohort, there were designated men whose sole task was to watch who fell and run to them. Imagine, hell is all around, a javelin flies, someone screams in pain, and a capsarius crawls through the mud to get to the wounded man. What was in that bag? No magic. Tight linen bandages, tourniquets, a flask of water, a sponge with vinegar to wash the wound, and perhaps oil. Nothing extra. Operations aren't done on the battlefield. The capsarius's task is not to cure, but to give a chance to survive until the rear. This is the golden hour of modern trauma care, discovered by the Romans 2,000 years ago. If a legionary had his shoulder slashed open, the capsarius had to do 3 things in seconds. First, clamp the artery. Otherwise, the fighter will bleed out in 2 minutes. Second, apply a pressure bandage. Third, pour a painkiller into the wounded man's mouth, or just give him a sip of wine so he doesn't pass out from shock. And all this while stones from slingers whistle overhead. But simply wrapping the wound isn't enough. The man needs to be extracted. A clear evacuation system worked in the Roman army. Capsarii often worked in pairs or used the help of cavalry. Imagine, a healthy man in armor weighs nearly 100 kilograms. Dragging such a body across plowed earth, under fire, is hellish work.
But they dragged them, because they knew, in the rear, behind the line of tents, a field hospital was already deployed where real doctors were waiting. This wasn't just helping a comrade, it was a job. Capsarii were exempt from duties, guard shifts, and digging work. They were paid to be ready at any moment to jump into the inferno and pull a life out of there. Imagine a modern ambulance fighting through traffic with sirens. The Romans did the same thing, only instead of traffic, men fighting to the death, and instead of lights, a red crest on a helmet. As soon as the wounded man was pulled out of the kill zone, his path lay further to the valetudinarium. Forget dirty tents where the wounded lie in heaps on damp ground. The Romans didn't build infirmaries, they built machines for recovery. In any major fort, from Britain to Syria, you will find a building that archaeologists recognize at first glance, the valetudinarium. If you walked into Napoleon's hospital in the 19th century, the smell of rotting meat, unwashed bodies, and death would knock you off your feet. Doctors of that time called it the hospital smell and considered it normal. But walking into a Roman valetudinarium, you would smell a sharp hit of vinegar in your nose, the smell of smoke from hearths where surgical instruments are being sterilized over fire, and a fresh draft. The Romans were obsessed with standards, a rectangle with an inner courtyard. Why a courtyard? Not for beauty. Fresh air and sunlight are the main enemies of dampness and stench. The Romans may not have seen bacteria under a microscope, but they were obsessed with the idea that stagnant, foul air breeds disease, and so they built in a way that the wind would sweep the stench out. Therefore, wide corridors, high ceilings, and cross ventilation. A Roman hospital didn't smell of death, it smelled of cleaning products. It wasn't a poorhouse, it was a repair shop. The layout was genius. Wards were positioned so that patients with fevers and those groaning and suffering from gangrene did not lie mixed with the freshly wounded. Those considered especially heavy and foul-smelling were kept separate so their breath and odors wouldn't poison the air around the rest. The Romans believed in miasmas, deadly spoiled air that brings sickness, and by instinctively separating such patients, they essentially invented unintentional quarantine long before Pasteur without even realizing it. In each ward, only 4 or 5 beds, no common halls for 100 people where one coughs and everyone dies. Silence, peace, control. But walls are half the battle. The main thing is the life support system. Channels for sewage disposal were often laid under the floor. Think about it, a sewer system in a military hospital of the 1st century. Europe would only return to this in the 19th. Clean water was piped directly to the building. No need to run with buckets to the river where foot wraps are being washed upstream. Water was the foundation of everything, for drinking, for washing, for scrubbing floors. Dirt in a valetudinarium was unacceptable. Who worked here? It was a whole corporation. At the head, the medicus castrensis, the chief military doctor. A man with an education, often a Greek, knowing anatomy not from pictures. Under him, a staff of junior doctors, dressers, and even administrators who kept records of patients. Yes, Romans kept medical histories. Legionary Gaius, 3rd cohort, chopping wound to the shin, admitted on the Ides of March, treated with wine, 3 stitches applied, discharged. Bureaucracy saved lives because the doctor on the next shift knew what the previous one did. Slave orderlies worked here too, changing linens, carrying out bedpans, feeding those who couldn't hold a spoon. The hospital kitchen cooked separately, broths, porridges, clean bread. A weakened body won't digest rough soldier stew. The valetudinarium was a fortress inside a fortress. Broken bodies were brought here, and soldiers walked out leaning on a stick, ready to return to the ranks. But to fix a human, walls and broth aren't enough. You need tools. And when we open a Roman surgeon's box found in Pompeii, a modern doctor's hands start to tremble, not from fear, from recognition.
Imagine walking into a modern hospital operating room. What do you see? Shiny metal, strict shapes, nothing superfluous. Now let's transport to Pompeii, to the house of the surgeon. On the table is a set that lay under ash for nearly 2,000 years. If you place modern instruments and Roman ones side by side, you'll start to get confused. Which is which? The scalpel. Romans made them from steel or bronze, a handle with ridges so it wouldn't slip in a bloody hand, interchangeable blades of different shapes. Yes, interchangeable blades. It got dull? Throw it out, insert a new one. The shape of the bellied scalpel for long incisions is identical to today's, because human anatomy hasn't changed, and the Romans found the ideal geometry of the cut through experience. Clamps. An artery needs to be clamped so the patient doesn't bleed out while the surgeon works. Roman hemostratic clamps had the same locking mechanism, the same finger rings, the same ridges on the jaws as the Billroth clamps used today. Rome's engineers understood the mechanics of gripping tissue better than many medieval blacksmiths. And now look at this object, an S-shaped metal tube. What does it look like? A lockpick? A plumbing part? No. Any man will wince right now. This is a catheter introduced into the urethra. And its shape is perfect. It repeats the anatomical curves so precisely that the design hasn't changed for 20 centuries. Bone saws, probes for exploring wound channels, forceps for removing bone fragments. This arsenal allowed for trepanation of the skull, amputations, removal of bladder stones. These weren't crude cleavers. This was a high-precision instrument, balanced for the master's hand. But there were things that appeared specifically for war. Roman medicine reacted to weapons progress. Enemies used barbed arrows. The Romans invented wound dilators, diastyleus. Read like a podcast. A screw mechanism pushed the edges of the flesh apart so the doctor could see what was inside without hacking the patient blindly. They even created special spoons for cleaning bone of pus and shards. Every detail screamed that surgery is a craft requiring the precision of a clock mechanism. A Roman doctor wasn't a mage, he was a technician of the human body, and he had a set of screwdrivers and wrenches for any type of breakdown. But there was one breakdown that baffled even experienced doctors. The arrow, especially an arrow with a wide barbed head stuck deep in the meat. You can't pull it. The barbs will turn muscle and veins into mince. Cutting it out means making a huge hole that can't be stitched. It seemed like a dead end. But Roman engineers looked at the problem and created an instrument that became legendary, the spoon of Diocles.
An arrow in the body isn't just a foreign object, it is a time bomb. If the arrowhead has barbs pointing backward, an attempt to yank the arrow turned a neat puncture into a severe lacerated wound. Hooks tore vessels, nerves, tendons. The soldier didn't die from the hit, but from the extraction. An ordinary doctor in such a situation either gave up or cut the flesh around it, turning the patient into a cripple. But there was a guy, Diocles of Carystus. He looked at the problem not as a doctor, but as a mechanic. If the barbs prevent exit, they need to be neutralized inside the body before we start pulling. Thus, the spoon of Diocles was born. Imagine a narrow metal chute, looking like half a tube. At the end, protective flanges.
The surgeon inserted this instrument into the wound parallel to the arrow shaft. The metal slid through the flesh, pushing tissues apart until it hit the arrowhead. And here the magic happened. The doctor carefully covered the arrow point with the spoon, like a sheath. The barbs, which were supposed to tear meat on the way back, ended up pressed against the metal of the instrument. The sharp edges were isolated. Click, the trap slammed shut. Now the surgeon could calmly pull the arrow, and it came out together with the instrument, sliding on smooth metal, not living flesh. Genius? Absolutely. Simple? Like everything genius. This tool saved thousands of lives where amputation used to be the best outcome. It was a triumph of engineering thought over the brute force of weapons. The Romans didn't just treat the consequences of war, they invented countermeasures. But pulling out the arrow is half the battle. Now you have an open wound into which dirt, pieces of clothing, and soil have fallen. In a world without antibiotics, this is a death sentence. Or is it? The Romans didn't know chemical formulas, but they had their own arsenal against invisible death.
We are used to thinking that before Lister and Pasteur, people lived in filth and died of sepsis at the side of a rusty nail. This is true for the Middle Ages, but not for Rome. The Romans were obsessed with cleanliness. Their baths weren't just a place to wash, they were a cult, and they dragged this obsession into surgery. The doctor's arsenal had two main liquid weapons, acetum, vinegar, and vinum, wine. Strong vinegar is an acid. It kills bacteria on the spot, although the Romans themselves would not speak of bacteria, but simply that the wound festers less and heals better after such washing. Wine, especially old and strong, worked as an alcohol antiseptic. Wounds were washed before the operation, during, and after. It stung so much that sparks flew from the eyes, but it saved lives. The second weapon is fire. Instruments were often calcined or scalded with hot water before surgery. Again, purely empirical experience. If the knife has been in the fire, there are fewer problems. They even used honey, a natural antibiotic that prevents bacteria from multiplying. Bandages with honey were applied to clean wounds, creating a barrier to infection. Clean hands, clean water, which was valued higher than wine in the Legion, bandages washed in lye. A Roman hospital smelled not of rot, but of the sharp scent of vinegar and herbs. It was a hostile zone for infection, although they explained it as fighting bad smells and polluted air, not invisible microbes. Now imagine that all this knowledge was taken and thrown in the trash, forgotten like a nightmare, and for the next 1,500 years, doctors would be proud of the crust of dirt on their coats. Welcome to the hell of the modern era.
Sometimes history doesn't go forward. Sometimes it stumbles, falls face down in the mud, and lies there for centuries. After the fall of Rome, medicine didn't just stop, it rolled back into the dark ages of superstition. Hygiene knowledge, painstakingly collected by ancient doctors, was declared unnecessary and sometimes even harmful. By the 19th century, the situation reached absurdity. Doctors of the Napoleonic Wars era considered pus a good sign. There was a term, laudable pus. They believed that suppuration was part of the healing process. Wash hands? Why? A gentleman is always clean, surgeons said, wiping a bloody knife on their frock coat before cutting the next patient. A dirty coat was a badge of experience, a medal for courage, but in reality, a breeding ground for death. And here, firearms enter the equation. A bullet is not an arrow and not a sword. A lead ball, flattening against bone, turns tissues into a bloody mess, driving scraps of dirty uniform, earth, and gunpowder soot inside. This is the ideal environment for gangrene. A Roman received a clean cut with a sword that could be washed and stitched. A soldier at Waterloo received a contusion wound with shattered bone, into which dirty fingers were immediately thrust. The result was monstrous. Mortality from limb wounds in the 19th century went off the charts. If a bullet hit a bone, the outcome was one, amputation. Moreover, a dirty, fast assembly line amputation. Surgeons competed in speed. Larry, Napoleon's surgeon, could cut off a leg in 2 minutes. This was necessary so the patient didn't die of pain shock, since there was no anesthesia. Paradox. Technologically, the world stepped forward. Cannons and rifles appeared, but a soldier died from infections more often than a legionary of Caesar. We learned to kill more effectively, but forgot how to save. A Roman doctor seeing a field hospital in the year 1815 would have burned it to the ground along with his colleagues, mistaking them for pests.
By the way, about pain shock, there is a myth that in ancient times the patient was simply hit on the head with a club or fed wine until unconscious, like suffer in silence, you're a man. This is a lie. The Romans weren't sadists, they were pragmatists. Screaming and twitching under the surgeon's knife interferes with work.
Forget scenes from movies where the hero is shoved a piece of wood in his teeth. Roman pharmacology was more powerful than people think. They didn't have ether or lidocaine, but they had nature, which they knew how to milk. The main caliber is the opium poppy. The Romans knew its properties perfectly well. The thick juice of poppy pods was dried, rolled into balls, and dissolved in wine. This is a powerful analgesic and sedative. A patient who took such a tincture didn't lose consciousness completely, like with general anesthesia, but fell into a deep stupor. The pain became distant, dull, somewhere in the background. He didn't scream, he just went quiet. The second component is mandrake, a root shrouded in mysticism, in reality contained scopolamine and hyoscyamine. In the right dosage, it causes sleep and amnesia. A person could survive an operation and then vaguely remember what happened at all. There was also henbane and lettuce seeds. Dioscorides, a military doctor of Nero's era, described recipes for sleeping sponges. A sea sponge was soaked in a mixture of opium, mandrake, and hemlock, dried, and before the operation, soaked in hot water and given to breathe the vapors or placed under the nose. Of course, it was a risk. The line between patient feels nothing and patient stopped breathing was thin, but experienced doctors knew how to balance. The main goal is to immobilize, so that the surgeon could make that jewelry-precise cut without fearing that his hand would tremble due to the patient's convulsions. So a Roman wounded man lay on the table not in agony, but in a narcotic fog. And when the operation ended, an equally important test awaited him, returning to the ranks. Because Rome didn't need invalids on a pension, Rome needed soldiers in the legion.
In the modern world, discharge from the hospital is the end of treatment. In Rome, it was only the beginning of work. Remember, a soldier is an investment. If after surgery he limps and cannot hold a shield, the money is wasted. No lie down and rest for a month. As soon as the wound closed, physical therapy began. Doctors forced soldiers to work out damaged limbs. First, simple movements, stretching. Then, exercises with weights. Gradually, the weight was brought up to the weight of combat weapons. Why did legionaries endure this pain in training? Not for the love of sports. Their money and future were at stake. If a commission found a soldier unfit, he might get a small allowance. But if he didn't recover fully, he risked losing the main prize, the land grant he had plowed 20 years for. Rome didn't pay for weakness. You either return to the ranks and get your land or go into poverty. Therefore, they pumped wounded legs with the persistence of the doomed. They fought for their pension. In the hospital, the wounded were fed better than the healthy. More meat, quality wine, vegetables, honey. The body received building material for tissue repair. The Optio Validunari, the hospital administrator, watched over this. If food was stolen, he could be executed. Strict quality control. The goal was won. Return the fighter to the cohort. And the statistics are astounding. Up to 70% of the wounded returned to service. Not home, not to the cemetery, but to the ranks. This is an incredible figure even for wars of the 20th century. And now, let's put it all together. Right now, in real time, we will see how this machine saves a life.
Torchlight dances on the walls. The smell of vinegar and herbs hits the nose. On the table lies Mark, a legionary of the second cohort. He is pale. Sweat rolls down his face like hail. A barbarian arrow sticks out of his thigh, deep. Briefing. The surgeon, a Greek named Alexander, washes his hands in a bowl of wine. He is calm. His instruments are laid out on a clean cloth, shining bronze, fresh from fire and hot water. Nearby are two strong orderlies, in case Mark twitches. Anesthesia. Alexander nods. An orderly brings a cup to Mark's lips. There is thick, dark wine with opium. Mark drinks greedily. In a minute, his gaze glazes over. His breathing evens out. He is here, but the pain goes somewhere far away. Preparation. The doctor takes a sponge generously soaked in vinegar. He wipes the skin around the wound. It hisses, foams. Dirt and blood are washed away. The battlefield is cleared for the main fight. The spoon of Diocles. Alexander takes the instrument. The thin shoot enters the wound softly. Mark groans through his teeth. His body tenses, but the opium holds him. Metal scrapes against metal. The spoon has found the arrowhead. The doctor makes an elusive movement, covering the deadly barbs of the arrow with the wings of the spoon. Click. The trap has snapped shut. A smooth pull towards himself, and the arrow comes out without touching a single major vessel. The ring of metal, the arrowhead, falls into a basin. Finale. There is blood, but it's not a fountain. Alexander takes a needle with silk thread. A stitch, another, a third. The edges of the wound are pulled together perfectly evenly. On top, a layer of honey and a linen bandage. That's it. Mark will live. In a month, he will pick up a shield. In 2, he will kill the one who shot that arrow at him. The system worked.
We are used to thinking that history is a ladder leading only upward, that tomorrow we will be smarter than yesterday. Roman medicine proves otherwise. We can lose everything. We can forget what saved millions and fall into the darkness of ignorance for 1,500 years. The lesson of Rome is simple and cynical. Humanism is born of pragmatism. The Romans created great medicine not because they were good Samaritans, but because they knew how to count money and value professionalism. They built a system where a human life had a concrete price, and they were willing to pay that price. The next time you see a surgeon's scalpel, remember, its shape wasn't invented in a modern research institute. It was invented by a nameless Roman master 2,000 years ago to pull a legionary back from the other world. And that legionary is still marching somewhere in our memory, alive and healthy, thanks to vinegar, bronze, and the iron logic of the empire. And finally, a question. Imagine you have a time machine and a sharp pain in your stomach. You have a choice. Go to the best surgeon in London in the year 1850, or to a legion military doctor on the border with barbarians in the year 100. Who would you turn to for help? Write honestly in the comments. Who would you trust with your life? A gentleman in a dirty frock coat or an ancient butcher with vinegar?